So, without further ado, I'd love to introduce our esteemed guest, Dr. Jessica L. Garay. Dr. Garay is an assistant professor in the Department of Nutrition and Food Studies at Syracuse University. Her research interests center on women's health with a focus on nutrition and physical activity behaviors during pregnancy, as well as the effect of diet and exercise performance among female athletes. Dr. Garay teaches undergraduate and graduate courses in research methods, dietary supplements, and sports nutrition. She earned a PhD in science education from Syracuse University and has worked as a registered dietitian nutritionist in community, outpatient, and private practice settings. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, Dr. Garay, and everybody in the audience. The virtual stage is now yours.
Great. Thanks so much for that introduction, Jess. And thank you all for joining today. I know it's a busy time of year, so I appreciate you guys joining us live for this talk. And I put these pictures up because I feel like the recent snow has made me kind of switch gears back to the fall time and thinking about like holidays. But I want to share with you today some tips that I think will be really helpful across the entire year. And so again, feel free to put your questions or thoughts in the chat box as we talk, and I think we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers at the end. So here is kind of the end at the beginning, right? These are really the two main tips and pieces of advice that I want to share today, and I'll go in more depth as we get started. But the first thing I want to talk about is really being realistic as a woman, as potentially a mother or a wife or a partner in some way, to just be realistic when it comes to healthy eating. And then the second piece that's kind of related is to be a good food role model. And that's really true if there are other people in your household that you're the main, food shopper or food preparer for. So in that, realistic frame of mind, I do want to emphasize that in the reality of dieting, there is no one like magic bullet, right? There's not going to be one single strategy that works for everyone when it comes to healthy eating or when it comes to managing your weight in some way. And I think that's really important because in the social media world that we live in, I am just always amazed by how many anecdotal reports we get about like, try this, it worked for me. And that somehow is like really convincing to a lot of people. So just keep in mind that if you see that, your neighbor has made changes and that is like one way that worked for her, that doesn't mean it's going to work for you. So there's really lots and lots of different ways to make changes to what we're doing eating wise. And we shouldn't stress if this one particular approach just doesn't resonate with us. There's lots of different ways that we can approach healthy eating, and what works for one person doesn't necessarily work for the other. So I just wanted to say that at the outset, because I'm going to kind of throw out a lot of different suggestions, and I'm not saying that any one of them is better than the other. They're just different ideas to try, and maybe, hopefully, one of them will kind of resonate with you. So I like this graphic. This came from the MyFitnessPal company, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. MyFitnessPal is a diet tracker, right? You can enter what you eat on their app and it'll kind of tell you what your nutritional profile looks like for the day. I'm not necessarily promoting the MyFitnessPal app, but I just liked this graphic, right? These things to think about to improve your nutrition. And I'm sure some of these may be things you've heard before. I just wanted to highlight what's in that top left corner to focus on small changes. I really believe that that's the key to consistent, lifelong success when it comes to both healthy eating and overall physical activity and exercise, not just for us as adults, but also for kids. But there's other things in here too that I think are really good points and really good strategies that, again, may work better for some people than others. I'm not necessarily an advocate of like daily logging of your food on an app like MyFitnessPal, but I know for some people that little bit of accountability is really helpful, especially when you're trying to establish some kind of new routine. Cooking more at home, I think, is also a great tip overall. And I think many of us have probably been doing a lot more of that over the last 2 years. So just some nice reminders that it doesn't always require some kind of magical, radical change to what you're doing to improve your eating habits. But I know many of us may have a different thing that jumps out to us from this graphic. So to get into these like small changes, right? What I have here is just a reminder as to like one potential small change you can make. If you're trying to eat healthier, you do not have to like throw away what you've been doing and start from a blank slate. It's honestly sometimes a matter of just making these little swaps or substitutions throughout the day. One place that I think some of us may be able to make improvements is with the calories we're getting from our beverages. And I put this up here as just an example. I know I'm in a bunch of different groups on Facebook, and I am always amazed when people talk about like what they order when they go to places like Starbucks or Dunkin' Donuts. And I think sometimes we don't always realize exactly what's in those drinks. So here's just a little bit of a comparison and a profile, which I always find really surprising, that in some of these drinks that are kind of branded as coffee drinks, there's really, really high amounts of sugar. And sometimes I think you may get that when you look at it, right? Especially if it's like pink or purple. I think there's just this expectation that it's sugary, but when it looks more like coffee, we may not realize that. So not to say you can never have drinks like this, but doing it in moderation, thinking about ways to maybe reduce the sugar content in the drink or reduce the calorie content in the drink. Those are really nice ways to still have that little treat, right? By getting something from Dunkin' Donuts or Starbucks, but maybe not having these really extra calories that you probably don't even realize you're consuming. So this is one place to maybe think about, what exactly am I consuming on a regular basis? And are there opportunities to modify the order or cut back, only do it a couple times during the week instead of every morning? Not only will that help your nutritional intake, but it'll also save you money, right? Because these are also not cheap. So they're calorically expensive, but they also are financially a high cost item. So one place, as an example, to make some small changes is to reevaluate where you're getting calories from in your beverages. And it's not just coffee beverages, it's beverages throughout the day. I often see a lot of students around campus that are drinking like a sports drink while they're sitting in class. And those have a lot of calories coming from sugar as well, which for an athlete is often very appropriate. But if you're just sitting in class, then maybe not as appropriate or necessary. I always like to tell people, if you're not really sweating, you probably don't need a sports drink. Nowadays, there's sports drinks that don't have as many sugar calories, but still provide electrolytes. So if that's what you're looking for out of something like a sports drink, it's certainly fine to still go for that, but maybe choose those lower calorie options if you're not really in need of the extra calories at that moment. So one small change to consider is really thinking about your drinks over the course of the day. This would be a place where maybe it's useful to use an app or just track what you're doing for 1 or 2 days, just to see, like on a normal day, how many calories am I consuming from beverages? And is there a way to reduce that or swap things out? One of the other things that I always worry about, especially with kids and teenagers, is that if they're choosing things like coffee drinks or energy drinks or soda, that's probably coming at the expense of more nutrient dense beverages like milk and possibly 100% fruit juice like orange juice. So we also want to think about that balance, right? That it's fine to have these drinks in moderation, but we also want to make sure that they're not replacing the more nutrient dense drinks that people need, and also just water, which we also need to make sure we're getting enough of, because these drinks are not necessarily going to provide us with as much real hydration as water or milk or 100% fruit juice. Okay, so that's one small change. Now, another kind of eating strategy that I always like to talk about is something that I had first learned about a couple of years ago. It was actually a contestant from The Biggest Loser, which, there's a lot of things about that show and the strategies on that show that I'm not a huge fan of, but this was a person who had been really successful in maintaining his weight loss after being on the show. And the strategy that he laid out just really struck me as kind of a clever approach. And so he kind of follows these like 3 F's, right? It's like F to the third. So the first one is fluids, then fillers, then feast. So when he talks about fluids, it's what you might expect, right? That you're making sure you're getting enough fluid throughout the entire day. And if you're trying to, manage your weight and potentially lose weight, then making sure you're staying really well hydrated and getting enough water in can actually help keep you feeling full, so that you may not be feeling the need to, consume as many food calories the rest of the day. So here's the $1 million question, right? Like, how much fluid do I actually need to consume? We don't have a great, like, uniform answer to that question that works for everyone. But I would say a really nice general rule of thumb is to think about your body weight in pounds and then divide that number in half. And that's how many ounces of fluid you should be trying to drink over the course of the day. So as an example, if you are a 160-pound person, you should aim to drink 80 ounces of fluid over the course of the day. That number will obviously go up a little bit if you're someone who's doing a lot of intense exercise and sweating a lot. That number also is not just referring to water. That's pretty inclusive of any fluid you're consuming over the course of the day. So that's kind of a nice checkpoint to see, oh my gosh, I only drink 20 ounces a day and I'm supposed to be drinking closer to 80 ounces a day. Again, not to scare people off, but just to provide that sense of accountability. So if you are currently only drinking 20 or 30 ounces, if you know you're not good about drinking, try to make those incremental changes, like try to up it by 8 ounces, right? That's like a small-ish water bottle. Once you can consistently get to 28 ounces a week or a day for like a week's time, then maybe see the following week if you can add another 8 ounces. And now you're getting closer to 36 ounces. So you're just gradually creeping up towards that ideal goal of 80 ounces each day. So that's one of these strategies, right, is to really focus on fluids. And that might be the only thing you focus on for the next month and just really get that under control. You're going to find that if you're properly hydrated, everything in life starts to get better, right? Your skin will look better. You will just be in a better mood. Your sleep might actually get better. Like, lots of things fall into place when we're properly hydrated. So that's one small change that can make a big difference, regardless of anything else that goes on with your eating habits. The second F here is for fillers. And this refers to the picture that I have on here as well. It's an idea that's been around for a long time and has never really picked up a lot of popular momentum in the media, which I am always surprised by. But this is an idea known as volumetrics. And I'm not trying to push a particular diet. This is more like a strategy for selecting food. And it's really about filling up on food that has a very low energy density, but a high nutrient density. And so you can kind of see this is a very informal scoring mechanism in the graphic. But the idea is that every time we have a meal, we should try to include a pretty large amount of these low energy dense but high nutrient dense foods, which by and large are fruits and vegetables. So the strategy in a volumetrics eating plan would be, let's say at lunch, to start out with some kind of broth-based vegetable soup or a fruit salad. At dinner, start your meal out with a really nice vegetable salad. And that way you're starting to fill yourself up with these foods that provide you with a ton of essential nutrients like vitamins and minerals, but that don't have a ton of calories for all of those nutrients. It's a really efficient way of eating. And then that idea of fillers then leads into the last F, which is feast. And this is my favorite part, right? This is to say that you should never feel like you're cutting out enjoyable foods on any kind of eating plan. That's just not sustainable, right? There's lots of diets out there like Whole30 to name one, that are really, really restrictive. It's like, you can't have this, you can't have this, you can't have this. And that might work in the short term, right? You might have buy-in to do that for like 2 weeks or 3 weeks, but we're trying to promote long-term eating strategies. And we're also trying to promote like good eating habits for kids to build into healthy eaters for the rest of their lives. And so this idea of focusing on bad foods that have to get cut out is not really the right mindset to be in. So within this volumetrics eating plan, it's saying if you are, starting your meal out with some of these low energy dense but high nutrient dense foods, then you can still have these other foods that you might enjoy that just happen to be higher in calories and maybe not as nutrient dense, but now be more mindful of the portion size that you're choosing for these types of foods. So the contestant from The Biggest Loser that I had first heard about this strategy from, he was saying, for him, it was that he loved chicken wings, like that was his feast food, but he would just cut back almost by half the number of chicken wings he would eat at dinner time, because he would start his meal with some of these filler fruits and vegetables. And I really like that approach. You're still able to have foods you enjoy, and just naturally by choosing these other lower calorie foods first, you'll be less hungry and less likely to eat too much of the feast foods. So that's, again, just a strategy. I think that also kind of starts to set us up for the right mindset that we want food to fuel us, and we want to choose the right foods to fuel us, especially if we are athletes or we have kids that are athletes. And so this idea of using those filler foods, they've got all the nutrients we need to help fuel our bodies. And then the feast foods are going to be the foods that we still enjoy eating, right? And that they still do provide us with some nutrients, but maybe are not quite as nutrient dense as the filler foods. So one thought to explore, again, if you wanted to try this strategy, I would first set a couple weeks up to just focus on the fluids, and then maybe take another couple of weeks to just reframe maybe only dinner, right? In terms of starting with the fillers before the feast, and see how that goes. And then maybe try to make that same strategy work for lunch, and maybe less important for breakfast. And you can read more about this if you wanted to Google the volumetrics eating plan. There's books about it. The woman who first created it is actually a dietitian and researcher out at Penn State. So it is something that has been around for a long time and has been, shown to be fairly effective for just gradual but, sustainable changes in eating patterns. Okay, so then the last point I wanted to make about some of these like small changes is an area of emerging research. And I find this really interesting. You've probably started to see people talk about this in different places, but we're starting to have a better understanding for how the time of day matters when it comes to eating. And I know initially that might make you think of like Oprah and talking about these rules like don't eat after 7 p.m. because it's all going to turn to fat. That's not what I'm getting at here. We are now having this better understanding of the connection between our body's natural circadian rhythm and our hormone levels that have this sort of daily like fluctuation, and what that might mean for when we eat and what types of things we eat. And so the fancy word here is chrononutrition, which is not like anything that I ever use, but it's just thinking about how we space out our meals and how we like balance out the macronutrients that are in our diet. And so there's a couple of things that have emerged in this area from research. One is that, the more we can stick to a fairly consistent sleep and wake cycle, the better off we'll be metabolically, regardless of what we're eating. A lot of research has shown that unfortunately, people who are like night shift workers or who have very variable sleep and wake patterns are more likely to have, issues with weight gain than people who just have a more consistent pattern. So that's one thing that we've noticed. The other thing that we've started to recognize is that there are some benefits on like it shows on the right-hand side here, on metabolic outcomes relating to our blood glucose levels or our weight management by adjusting the window when we eat or what we eat during that eating window. And so one thing that I'm not going to get into too much, but I know we've probably heard people talk about intermittent fasting, and there's definitely a lot of different approaches to that. And there are some that are much more extreme than others. But the research around intermittent fasting does seem to suggest that if you follow kind of a moderate profile, which I think a lot of us do anyway, which is sort of like, eat during a narrow window and then fast when you're sleeping, that can be fairly beneficial overall, but particularly in terms of things like weight management and even glucose control. But the other thing that I think is less talked about that I still see good research support for is that if we kind of front load our carbohydrates during the early part of the day and gradually taper them, and then have our evening meal be more focused on protein, but still having some carbs, just maybe a smaller portion, that actually aligns a little bit better with our natural like insulin levels and just our natural patterns and circadian rhythms. So again, not suggesting that everyone start making some shift that's really dramatic, but just an approach, something that might be worth trying if you feel like you've tried all these other strategies and nothing works to improve your weight or change your overall metabolic health. It's this idea of having like a more carb-focused breakfast meal or morning meal, and then gradually reducing that and having protein be more of the focus of the latter part of the day when you're eating. There's more to it. That's kind of a very oversimplification of the strategy, but again, something that we're seeing as a successful eating pattern in research. And I think for those of us that are feeling kind of frustrated or stuck with different strategies that might not have helped us with weight management, could be an interesting one to try. And when I say that you want to try these things out, I don't mean like try it for a day and then expect great changes. It would be something that you'd have to really commit to doing for a couple of weeks before it's really possible to evaluate if it's having any beneficial impact on things like your blood glucose levels. So happy to talk more about that when we get to the Q&A if there are questions, but it's just something that we've seen in research and I think is interesting to consider. Okay, so the last points in this whole be realistic theme is that we also need to be realistic about what is possible to pull off. And I say this as a working mom of 3, that as much as I want to cook from scratch for my kids and make healthy meals, it's just not always feasible to do that. So there's definitely some financial privilege involved in what I'm about to suggest, but I think in a lot of stores now, you'll see that there are prepared foods, not like prepared meals, although that exists too, but let's say, pre-cut or pre-washed produce. Some of those quick strategies can be really helpful in still making food at home that's, not going to take you quite as long. So for me, I really hate cutting up onions. I have this really strong response, tears stream down my face. So if I can buy the pre-cut onions, that's a win for me, right? That I can still include them in my meals, but I don't have to take the time and suffer the consequences of cutting them myself. So that's just one example of trying to make some of these compromises to still eat healthy at home. There's other ways, right, that we can also make convenience work for us. There's so many places around now where you can pre-order your groceries or have groceries delivered. So that also saves the time of having to go get the groceries and might still support you being able to cook meals at home. I'm also a fan of some of the quick cooking versions of foods. So I do use instant oatmeal. I love the 90-second bags of rice. In my mind, the convenience of using those outweighs any concerns I have about the processed nature of those foods. It's just a really nice, quick option. And then if you are getting vegetables that you do need to prep, if you're buying groceries on, say, a Sunday, then maybe trying to take a little bit of time on Sunday afternoon to prep them for whatever you need over the next couple of days. And that way, during the week, you don't have to spend that time. You can just bag it up and keep it in the fridge for when you need those particular items. So lots of ways to kind of still cook at home, cook from scratch, but have some of these like quicker options available. And I'm sure there's other strategies that I'm forgetting. So if you have a strategy that works in your house for still cooking at home, but making it work for you, feel free to drop it in the chat. It'd be great to see what else people are doing to eat healthy at home, and still feel like you're able to do that during the week with everything else that's going on. All right, so the bottom line, I think, in terms of this idea of being realistic, is to also recognize that it's just not possible to eat healthy all of the time, right? And I see this a lot of times when people put themselves on a diet. Let's say they have a social gathering, like a friend's birthday, a week into their diet, and they go to the party and they have a piece of cake, and now they're like devastated because they've fallen off of the plan. Well, that's okay, right? Like, your eating habit success is not going to be derailed by one time not sticking to what you should be doing. And so I usually encourage this with athletes that I talk to, that we should all really try to embrace this idea of like an 80-20 rule when it comes to healthy eating. 80% of the time, we should really try to be as good as possible when it comes to healthy eating. But 20% of the time, we can be a little bit more flexible, and it's going to be just fine, right? We're not going to ruin all of our progress that we have worked for in that other 80% of the time. So I like to say, give yourself that flexibility. Like 80% of the time, try to make your meals pretty healthy, try to have healthy snacks. 20% of the time, it's okay to let loose a little bit, but being mindful, right? Like not giving yourself that exception all the time, because then it starts to creep into like 50-50, which is probably not the right kind of balance. But I think it's nice to just be reminded about that, because again, we're kind of bombarded with all of these social media images of people that look like perfection, and so they must be doing this all the time. And the reality is, we don't have to be perfect all the time. I don't think anyone really is, and that's okay. So that's the realistic part of my advice. So then the second piece that I wanted to talk about is really being a good food role model. And again, this can be in any context. If you're a teacher, it's with the students that you have. If you're a parent, it's with your kids. Just really promoting good habits for yourself that other people are also observing. So I think, first of all, it just comes back to basics, right? That we want to be at each eating occasion trying to structure our plates to fall in line with the MyPlate guidelines. And I would say, for those of us in sort of this like adult generation, this is kind of a change from how we were raised to eat or how we learned about eating. This idea that half of our plate should really be made up of fruits and vegetables, and then the other half should be kind of a split between grains and protein. We've grown up with like Olive Garden, where the whole plate is pasta, or Outback Steakhouse, where the whole plate is a steak, right? So this is definitely a shift, but it goes back to that idea of the fillers and the feast, and that balance between the low energy dense but high nutrient dense foods like fruits and vegetables, and then maybe some of the foods that are higher in calories, more energy dense, like possibly grains and protein foods. So this is just a nice, real basic strategy to try to focus on. And I think it's a nice talking point, especially when you have kids and you're trying to educate them about healthy eating, to just sort of point out at dinner, like, what is from each of these food groups and what's the proportion like on our plate. There's a lot of really great resources on the MyPlate website. They actually now have some integrations with Alexa, which is pretty cool. So there's a lot more information that you can get at that website. And it's been updated. So if you checked it out when you were like first learning about it, there's a lot more to it now. So I highly encourage you to use this and to try to talk about it with your kids if you have them, because they may hear about it in school, but I think it's not always in the context of what they're eating. It's like in health class. And so it's nice to connect it back to food. Since this graphic just has the names of the food groups, it's nice to see a plate of food and then try to, make the connections. So just over the next couple of days, trying to take a look at what your plate looks like at each meal, and then thinking about what small changes you might be able to make to your plate to better align with these proportions and food groups that are outlined in the MyPlate graphic. And I say that, right, that we should use MyPlate as the standard, because what we know is that unfortunately for both adults and kids, when we look at where people are getting their vegetable intake from, it's mostly coming from potatoes. And you can probably imagine where I'm going with this, that for kids and adults, our potatoes are really coming in the form of French fries. And so even for kids as young as toddlers, right, like potatoes in the form of fries are the most predominant vegetable that they tend to eat. And followed up somewhat closely for adults by like iceberg lettuce and tomatoes, which are the vegetables you find on a burger, right? So we have some work to do. And again, this all goes back to being a good food role model. Like if we're going to get a burger and fries, that's okay, right? That certainly fits in that 20% of the time, but we don't want to get in the routine of doing that, because then it starts to establish for kids that that's the norm for dinner or lunch. So there's definitely some good options aside from that, especially if you're cooking at home, but also even now at some of these fast food restaurants and the kids' meals in particular, they have other options so that French fries are not the only side item available. So now I want to just wrap up by sharing a couple of really interesting and clever resources that I think might be useful. If you haven't heard of these before, there's a group of campaigns. This first started at Johns Hopkins, and actually here at SU, we have a lot of these on campus, but they're called the Monday campaigns. And the most well-known of them is Meatless Monday. And but you can see it's expanded. And all of these come down to the idea that Monday is often the day when people are like, you know what, I'm going to start doing this on Monday, right? It's like, that's the start of the week for most of us. And so that's often the day that's indicated for like starting whatever health kick you're going on. And, you don't have to stick with it all week, but just starting small, like, okay, we're going to commit to doing this every Monday and then see how it builds. So Meatless Monday is an idea that maybe we take one day out of the week and try to have a meatless dinner or meatless all day. That can be a nice way to just branch out and try some kind of new recipe that you haven't ever had before. It can be a nice way to make sure that you're like following the MyPlate guidelines and really focusing on fruits and vegetables on those days. There's lots of really cool ways to incorporate a Meatless Monday idea into either the whole day or just the dinner meal. Here on campus, they offer Meatless Monday options in the dining halls. And then we also offer like free fruits and vegetables in the fitness facilities for students. There's really great resources on their website, and you can sign up for their listserv and they'll email out clever recipes to try for each Monday. The rest of these are also really interesting. And the one I'll point out in addition to Meatless Monday is the Kids Cook Monday. This is a similar idea that we would want to encourage kids to get involved in the kitchen. And so Monday is maybe a good day to try to have like a simpler recipe that might be pretty quick to do, but also a recipe that kids can get involved in making. And I think that's a great way to motivate kids to try new things, is that if they're involved in making it, they're more likely to actually want to eat it, even if it involves new or unfamiliar foods in the recipe itself. So check out the Monday campaign websites if you want to find out more, but I really think that is another way to just make some small changes and see how it goes, and maybe then build it into the rest of your week. The other resource that I really think is clever is a group called Kids Eat in Color, and they have a website and they have a big social media presence. But their strategy is just around this idea that most of us are fairly visual people, kids included. And so if we're trying to make healthier changes, we want to be really deliberate about the language we're using when we have conversations with kids around eating healthy. And so they have really great graphics to kind of help give parents and caregivers ideas about how to communicate with kids in terms of getting them to try different types of fruits or vegetables. And I just love this one because it has some really fun words that we might not think about normally, but these might actually make it more appealing for the kids to try. And they have all sorts of other strategies as well around how to explain the nutrients and the benefits of eating certain types of foods over others. And they have some good ideas for packing like healthy lunch options. So something else that might be worth checking out. And in addition to those resources, I did want to also mention that there's a fellow dietitian by the name of Jill Castle who has some really great information about feeding kids if that's a challenge that you're having. There's also a branch of our national nutrition organization called Kids Eat Right, which is affiliated with the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. They have really great information and resources, recipes, and things on their website. And then there's another dietitian who has a Facebook page called Real Mom Nutrition. And so I know those are really family focused, but I still find that even as like when I'm just by myself trying to eat, some of those strategies still apply to me as well, right? Because we're all just big kids. So I put my email on here too. I'm happy to be a resource if you have other questions or if there's anything else that you are interested in talking about. But I think we have a little bit of time where I'm happy to stop sharing and then we can see if people have questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Garay. That was really informative and so much information. And I just wanted to express gratitude from the Y of Central New York for your time and for sharing all of these concepts together so that we can work to try to understand how small changes can over time really build some healthier practices. I know earlier today in a meeting, one of my colleagues who happens to be on this call, we were talking about how we know routine really benefits us, but we're like so resistant to it, you know, like we're just like allergic to routine in a way that you know, really in some ways is self-sabotaging, right? So I love your idea about focusing on one small thing to do a day, you know, for a period of time to be able to sort of introduce that change into your life. So I personally wanted to thank you for that. And I would also love to invite folks to please put any questions that they have in the chat so that Dr. Garay can answer those for us and we can continue this conversation for the next about 20 minutes or so. But to get started, I would love to ask if you could speak a little bit more about picky eating kids. Like, how do you suggest, you know, making some of these changes with kids who are really picky about what it is that they will eat?
Yeah, thanks, Jess. I think one thing to keep in mind is that picky eating in kids is really common. That's honestly like a normal part of their development. And as you all probably know, there's like really comfort foods that most kids really like, things like peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, but we can't always let them eat that forever. So trying to get kids beyond their normal, like small, you know, selection of foods they like to eat is more about repetition. So we want to offer foods to a child at least 7 times before we really allow them to decide if it's something they like or not. And we also want to make sure that when we offer these things to kids that we're not forcing them to eat it, that we're like offering it to them and then kind of leaving it up to them as far as what happens next. There's a really well-known child feeding expert, and she says that, you know, the parents and the caregivers were in charge of deciding what is offered, but the child is ultimately in charge of deciding whether or not they're going to eat it and how much they're going to eat. So we also have to just accept the fact that we don't have full control over what they're eating, except for what we're offering to them. And so again, it's like, make sure you're offering it to them at least on 7 different occasions for them to really evaluate what they want. We also need to recognize that some kids do have very specific preferences, not so much for the food item, but for things like the texture, right? If there's any sensory issues, sometimes it's like, oh, that's slippery or that's too crunchy, right? There may be some like sensory issues going on with the food itself. So then we'd want to just figure out what types of foods are acceptable from that standpoint. But pickiness is often a phase, right? It will, in some cases, just get better on its own. This is also a place where I see a role for like positive peer influence, right? We tend to see that if kids are in an environment where they're eating with other kids, if they see the other kids eating carrot sticks, they may be more likely to eat them or at least try them. But if it's like the parent saying to do it, it's maybe a different reaction. And that is true like for lots of ages of kids, but more as you get into like school age where they're having these opportunities to eat with peers, there may be in some cases like not great influences on what they want to eat based on what they're seeing their peers eat, but it could help to get over that pickiness if they're like all of a sudden now realizing there's a lot more out there.
Thanks so much. It looks like we have a question coming in from Jenny Hughes, who asked if you can explain circadian rhythm and glucose a little bit more.
Yeah, good question, Jenny. So I'm certainly not like an endocrinologist, and so I don't have all of the in-depth knowledge about this, but my understanding and reading some of this research that is pretty fascinating to me is that our natural patterns are that for most people, our blood glucose is fairly low in the morning when we wake up, which makes sense because we haven't eaten overnight. And so as soon as we eat in the morning, we will sort of spike our insulin in response to that, like going from low to high-ish glucose when we eat something. And then over the course of the day, our glucose levels will kind of fluctuate based on whether we're exercising or not and what else we're putting into our bodies. But insulin, in some ways, is always going to be responsive to the glucose that we're putting into our bodies or the glucose that we're using with exercise, but it also has like some stability and predictability in terms of how much insulin we're producing and releasing. That has kind of this, they call it like a diurnal pattern. And so if we start to think about that predictability of insulin, and also just the fact that we start out at low glucose in the morning, the strategy that's been tested out in some of these research studies has been this idea around like having a more carb heavy breakfast, knowing that pretty much anything you eat with carbs in the morning is going to cause like a fairly strong insulin response. And then if you have less carb in your meal at the end of the day, that theoretically should create a lower insulin response, which is good because there's already maybe slightly lower insulin levels at that time of day compared to the morning. And so it just sets us up for a better, not just glucose levels, but insulin as a hormone is not just having effects on glucose. Insulin is a storage hormone. So it's basically anytime it's being released, it's promoting storage in our body of glucose. And sometimes if we have excess glucose, of some of that into our fat cells as well. So if we have less of that happening at the end of the day, then we're not necessarily going to be in that sort of energy storage mode overnight, which again, if you have goals around like weight control, that might actually be beneficial. I'm not sure that I'm explaining that like super eloquently at this point, but that's generally the thought process behind it. It is still kind of an emerging area for us to be thinking about this connection between our macronutrient distribution and the time of day. And so far, a lot of the research that's looked at this has actually done some intervention with people who are like night shift workers or who have these like variable circadian rhythm patterns. So it's still a little bit unclear how this might work with those of us that have a more like consistent sleep and wake cycle. But what we're seeing is sort of promising that there might actually be a benefit to like front loading carbs. Having said that, when you think about people who exercise, that throws an extra wrinkle in, right? Like if you're someone who exercises in the evening, then you're putting like different strains on your body than someone who's maybe exercising in the morning. And so your eating strategy will have to certainly account for when you're exercising, because the time of the day of exercise is also going to impact these other, things like glucose and insulin.
Thank you so much for that super comprehensive answer. So many things to consider as like an active body in the world, right? I have a question actually, and it's around some of the medical diets that have become kind of mainstream. So like the keto diet, gluten-free, even like anti-inflammatory kind of style eating. And I was wondering if you could give a little perspective on those things.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a value for all of those diets depending on the individual circumstances, but it's a perfect example of what I was saying at the beginning, that I think one of the harms of social media is that now we have like millions and millions of anecdotal opinions, and that doesn't mean that if it works for that person, it's going to work for you. So when it comes to something like the keto diet, I think for some people that just clicks and it really works well for them. But I think for a lot of people, it's not a sustainable way to eat. So you may be able to try it out for a couple of weeks. And most likely, if you're going to try the keto diet for a few weeks, you'll likely see a change in the number on the scale. I'm not going to say you're going to lose weight, because a lot of people, when they first start the keto diet, part of the change on the scale is actually a loss of water weight because you've depleted your muscle glycogen. It's not anything about fat loss. And so if you go off the keto diet, you may see the number go back up again, because now you've just retained some of that water that you had initially lost when you depleted your glycogen. So for some people, it can be a long-term strategy, but I would say in my experience, by and large, it's something that is just really hard to maintain for a long time, especially when you start to think about like eating for other people and cooking for kids. It's just not always possible to do that. For something like gluten-free, there's definitely some medical conditions that really require a gluten-free diet, and it's absolutely the best strategy to resolve them. Like if you have celiac disease, I think in a lot of other situations, there's, possible like sensitivities to gluten. And so it might be something to try out. And if you have a gluten sensitivity, then if you cut gluten out of your diet, you should fairly quickly start to see improvements in your overall like health. If you cut it out and you're not really seeing many changes, then it's probably not something that's related to gluten. So I think in some ways we've started to like demonize gluten, and it's not really a problem for a lot of people. But there are, some individuals who definitely have a need to cut that out of their diet. And then for other things like intermittent fasting, I think that could be an interesting strategy to try. It does look like there's some benefit for some people to reduce the eating window and lengthen the fasting window. I, again, think about athletes. That's often just not practical given how many calories an athlete might need to eat and the timing of like supporting their exercise with food. I also think about with kids, it's probably just not appropriate for them to really reduce their eating window. So there's so many outside factors that go into it. And again, when you see someone on social media promoting a certain diet, their external factors and their lifestyle are probably very different from yours. So we just have to keep all of those like other influences in mind if we're going to make a change to what we're eating. But I go back to the idea that like small changes are key. So a lot of those types of diet approaches represent pretty radical changes. So small changes, I think, is the ticket to success, at least for long-term success.
Thank you so much. We've got a question coming in from Jean, who is specifically asking about runners and wants to know what some causes of hand swelling while running might be, if that can be rectified by looking at your water intake.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that it may not necessarily be like completely related to your hydration. Sometimes it's more about just like body positioning and the effects of gravity when you're running, right? And so if you're holding your hands down below your heart, like blood's kind of like just naturally pooling that way. So it may not be related to hydration, but certainly when you're having issues with like swelling and any sort of like fluid shifting in your body, I do always circle back to, okay, is it hydration related or is it electrolyte related? So if you're doing a lot of running and you're running for long stretches of time, I would make sure that you're not just drinking water, that you're drinking water that has electrolytes. And when I say electrolytes, I mean salt, like sodium and chloride, which most sports drinks have. And then possibly also magnesium and calcium. I know people don't always realize like they're technically also electrolytes. Some more like mainstream commercial sports drinks may not have them in there, but there are some other sports drinks that do have one or the other added. You can also, play around with like making your own sports drink at home, kind of like a salty lemonade is what I usually suggest starting with. So it may be related to hydration, but it may just also be body positioning. And so if you have that happening a lot, maybe just trying to like set a timer almost and just trying to like squeeze the muscles in your fingers and move your hands around to just redistribute and get that to literally like drain and go against the gravity that's pulling it down.
Thanks so much for that answer. If anyone else has any final questions, please throw it in the chat. We're about to wrap up. But as I usually like to do for these kinds of events, I like to ask our speakers to leave us with any final thoughts or any reflection that you'd really like for us to walk away with today. So do you have any final thoughts that you would like to offer us?
Yeah, I will just kind of reiterate what I mentioned before, that I think especially in 2022, we've kind of all been through the gauntlet lately. And so I think we need to treat ourselves with grace when it comes to healthy eating, because there's so much going on in our lives. Again, keep that 80-20 rule in mind, that you don't have to be perfect all the time when it comes to eating. And if there are some like shortcuts you can take to make it a little bit more convenient to cook at home and eat healthy, you shouldn't feel guilty about doing that. And so, keeping yourself like just perspective in mind when it comes to healthy eating. Small changes are great. Maybe just evaluating like your fluid status first and then starting with some other things. But just knowing that you're doing a great job, and we've all been through a lot, so we shouldn't put too much pressure on ourselves to eat perfectly all the time.
Well, thank you so much for your time and your wisdom and your expertise today, Dr. Garay. It's really been beneficial for me, and I know for many of the folks here on the call. I do want to let everybody know that we will have the video of this posted online on the Virtual Y and also on our YouTube within the next week or two, so keep your eyes out for that. And if you do have any questions about anything in the presentation today, you can always reach out to me, virtual@ymcacny.org, and I'm happy to share the resources of today or connect you with Dr. Garay. So thank you so much, everybody. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day as you contemplate making small, sustainable changes.